Nostalgic films are not all-inclusive. Because movies are innately selective, as they must adhere to time requirements, a nostalgic representation of the past is innately exclusive. Nostalgia, derived from nostos for return home and algia for longing, the nostalgic experience of longing is shared, but the home for which the longing is felt is not a unanimous one. As such, adolescent films seek to capture an inclusive nostalgia for the masses. Nostalgia is not simply a longing for the past, but rather is a complex web of ideas, which can be broken apart into various theoretical thoughts. In order to understand nostalgia in adolescent nostalgic films, several of these theories need to be explored first. Scott Alexander Howard's first two requirements for nostalgia illustrate two different yet correlated nostalgic modes. The naivete requirement encompasses the longing for a time when one was unaware of the impermanence of one's surroundings, a state of mind not yet initiated into loss. Such nostalgia is directed towards a time of youth, where the human condition, the knowledge of death and its inescapability, was yet to be known, and traumatic loss had not occurred. A child is not nostalgic because they are unaware of the definitive end. They live exclusively in the present, not staying forlornly to the future, nor are paralyzed longing for the past. However, this requirement does not exclusively refer to the past. The present can be understood as the past of a future event. The future is innately unpredictable, and such a person experiencing, say, a nostalgia for the present, for the future past, may too fit into this requirement. However, this time comparison slightly confounds the time account of this requirement. Howard's poverty of the present requirement more directly addresses nostalgia with a refined time scope. Rather than limiting itself to a time of most likely youthful ignorance, this requirement insinuates that a negative evaluation of the present is escaped through the judgment that the past was better. The judgment need not be correct, just that the past is viewed to be preferable in comparison to the present. Howard writes that nostalgia imaginatively projects desirable features onto the past, compromising both the past in the inauthentic recollections of it and the present for its disregard in favor for manufactured memories. It is this requirement which presents itself a challenge to all three time zones, the past, present, and future. In both cases, the nostalgic experience quells present negativity by escaping to the past and, if but momentarily, to slow the imminence of death. The main notable difference is their temporal relation. Where nostalgia defined by the poverty of the present requirement gazes exclusively backwards, nostalgia seen through the lens of the naivete requirement pivots on the present between the past and future. Therefore, the present is of primary interest as it accounts for both of these requirements. Kraskowska describes the present and its relation to past and future as a funnel. The past is the funnel, the tapered end the present, and the future flows out unconfined. She writes that the farther back we look, the softer our focus, the more diluted and permeable time appears. That is, all past experience fits into the funnel which spirals down to the present, but the farther back in the past correlates to the larger end of the funnel, where the substance is less concentrated. Here, the pivot point between the funnel and its end is the present, and at this point sits the potential to look towards both times. Fredric Jameson, too, writes of a nostalgia for the present and describes it as follows. Here, a certain Nietzscheanism operates to diffuse the anxiety and even fear. The conviction, however gradually learned and acquired, that there is only the present and that it is always ours is a kind of wisdom that cuts both ways. The future can be experienced briefly through imagination either as better or worse than the present, but ultimately fades back to the reality of the contemporary. Likewise, the past can be experienced similarly. The past can easily be constructed to be rosy-hued and selectively forgetful to alleviate the concerns of the present. Jameson writes that the Nietzschean wisdom then tells us to let go of that kind of fear and reminds us that whatever social and spatial form the future becomes, it will by definition be ours. This does not alleviate the anxieties of the future, particularly of death's approach. It does, however, signify the nostalgia experienced in the present. Films on adolescence play on the idea of being present, of living life before the complexities of the future take hold and youthful ignorance becomes impossible. With the lens focused on the lives of its characters, these films seek to capture memory and preserve it in a sense of youth. Two films which center around the present as reactionary to future uncertainty are Barry Levinson's Diner and Richard Linklater's Dazed and Confused. While both can be summarized as engaging in drug and alcohol-heavy hijinks, this very characterization illustrates both films' nostalgic desire for youthfulness and suspended adolescence. Set in 1959, the characters of Diner, returning to Baltimore for Eddie's wedding, are swept up in reminiscing about their childhood days while staring into the face of their newfound adulthood. Each of the 5 main characters, Eddie, Boogie, Fen, Shrevey, and Billy, all face difficult challenges in their present lives. Eddie is getting married, Boogie has a gambling problem, Fen is a college dropout and perpetually drunk, Billy wants to marry a woman who does not want to marry him, and Shrevey is in an unhappy marriage. Their return to their past lives, specifically to Fells Point Diner, reignites their childhood nostalgia and allows them to briefly escape from the realities of the present. In this way, Howard's poverty of the present requirement is met, and they all make individual negative assessments of the present and then, aided by a selective memory, flee to an idealized and imaginary past. This is both done individually and collectively. Each man faces their own particular issue with their present, and each has their own nostalgia in response. The most obvious is Shrevey, who, during a one-sided argument with his wife, says that music reminds him of certain times. His collection of records removes him from the present to a nostalgia triggered by the music. Yet, his particular response to his wife listening to the music calls into doubt the true nature of his nostalgia. A collection can carry its owner back beyond time to their childhood, and imprint upon the owner a nostalgic subjectivity. That's to say, Shrevey's nostalgia for his records, and perhaps more particularly the music, may send him back to his childhood, to a simpler, happier time. However, his wife's engagement with his nostalgia dilutes the escapist effects the music has for Shrevey. His nostalgia fulfilled by the poverty of the present requirement then appears to be ineffective in distracting him from his present condition. The frequent return to the diner grounds the group's nostalgia to a distinct location. Nostalgia's definition of longing to return home may refer to a location or an idealized and thereby fictional home. Nostalgic longing is a romance with one's own fantasy that can only survive in a long-distance relationship, and it becomes clear that it is not the diner that elicits the group's nostalgia, but the memories of times which are tied to that location. They seem to understand that the past is transient and the future's unpredictability is untenable, but their reunion sparks a nostalgic recreation of their boyish shenanigans. This change encompasses all 3 times, past, present, and future. Svetlana Boym writes that fantasies of the past determined by needs of the present have a direct impact on the realities of the future. Because the characters find themselves at the intersection between childhood and adulthood, they long for the simplicity of their adolescence and how they can never return back to it. This is, in part, sparked because of the reunion, but also for their coming of age. Likewise, then, once the nostalgic episode comes to pass and they repart ways again, the future of adulthood becomes inevitable. The group's nostalgia is of paramount interest in comparison to the individual in this case. The director creates a 50s representation characterized by white male heteronormativity. Portraying the period in this way illustrates an attentive lens to this particular demographic's narrative, namely the boyish, misogynist nature of the men. The film's return to national symbols and myths appears to say the following: a group of white men can exclude women, but still drag them along and discuss them as simply objects, a matured version of the childish myth of cooties. The movie's appropriation of white, heterosexual male narrative appears to speak to the coming of age from boy to man, to understanding the meaning of adult relationships while still having a sense of youthful playfulness. Dazed and Confused illustrates a bizarre reflection of 70s adolescence. As a 90s film, the movie attempts to capture the sense of teenage freedom, notably through its party scenes, lack of parental supervision, and the coming of age of sexual desires. Interestingly, the film illustrates almost pedophilic notes with senior boys' rampant desire to paddle the incoming freshmen. While this hazing of the freshmen by the seniors does posit a dual perspective of future memory, both age groups do share common infatuation with remaining in the present. Cynthia appears to single-handedly embody the film's present nostalgia. Considering going to a party, she says to her friends, "Don't you ever feel like everything we do and everything we've been taught to do is just to service the future? But what are we preparing ourselves for?" When her friend responds candidly, "Death," she says, "That's valid because if we are gonna die anyways, shouldn't we be enjoying ourselves now? You know, I'd like to quit thinking of the present, like right now, as some minor insignificant preamble to something else." This fits snugly into the gray area in Howard's naivete requirement. Cynthia, if taken to be indicative of the characters' mentalities as a whole, is aware of the impermanence of her present surroundings and imagines the present as the subject of a future memory. Her actions, attending parties, drinking, smoking weed, and staying up all night, is suggestive of capturing and maintaining a moment of youthful bliss. Her awareness of the future and the present's relation to it as a preamble is symptomatic of present nostalgia, to make the future past something worth reflecting on and longing for. In this sense, the desire to remain perpetually adolescent appears as an attempt to inoculate oneself against future nostalgia. Krystowska says that the diagnosis of nostalgia's perversion thus implies a cure, that the present, or what used to pass for it, will be construed as past and as an object of longing, and that the nostalgia for the present becomes repeatedly regressive. The characters within the film illustrates the attempt to cure future longing with the engagement in the present experience. The character's estrangement from the past and future to live in the present offers itself as an interesting interpretation of nostalgia. That is, while still reactionary to the future's unknowability, the focus for the nostalgic lies within the present and its relevance to the future, rather than the past and its escape from the progression of the present. Krystowska further affirms that nostalgia is often spurred by regret, and thus the character's actions in the present speaks to their desire for satisfaction. Because the present then is only escapable through the imagination of a different time, the present becomes definitively malleable when considered as a future past event. Following the party, Dawson and his friends lay on their high school football field and discuss living in the present rather than worrying about the future. During this conversation, Dawson says, "All I'm saying is that I want to look back and say that I did the best I could while I was stuck in this place." While place may refer to the spatial definition, that is, to his high school, used temporally correlates to the film's nostalgia for the present. Here, too, the characters consider their present as an experience of their present as past and as history, and thus appear to be nostalgic of it. This operation, as Jameson would say, is mobilizing a vision of the future in order to determine its return to a historical present. This return then spurs the characters to live without regret in the present. The malleability of the present then questions the period's reflection of itself. Contextually, the characters' self-consciousness of their lives points to their nostalgic outlook on their period. Cynthia's discussion of the every other decade theory, in which every other decade switches between being good and bad, highlights the ability to endow a period with certain attributes, stereotypes, and qualities which are not entirely indicative of the period. Where Cynthia describes the 70s, her present, as bad, she indicates her optimism towards the future. Several questions can be raised then in regards to this. Did the period, the 70s, see itself this way, or is this a projection from the creators of the movie onto the past? Cynthia's projection onto the 70s, saying that they sucked, juxtaposes her youthful desire to be present against the negative representation she provides the period. While Jameson claims that periods can be manipulated into stereotypes not truly representative of the period itself, Dazed and Confused illustrates the idea that while the period may be bad, consider for a second the rampant criminal hazing and the lack of punishment for the hazers. Adolescence appears to win over this negativity. Viewers see this idea in Mike, the original primary target for the hazing, who was quickly accepted into the ranks of the seniors. The pains of the present are almost immediately erased once the blanket of adolescent excitement covers him. The two films appear to speak towards a cultural desire for adolescence and to revoke the progression of time. Diner's recapturing of youth after time apart insinuates the desire to return to a time of childhood, whereas the desire to remain in the present state of youthfulness appears in Dazed and Confused. In either case, there exists a sense of naivete which leads to each film's nostalgic undertones. Diner illustrates an apparent collective desire to return to the ignorance of childhood, to a period of boyish troublemaking and simplicity. The film projects the desires of its lead characters, heterosexual white men, onto the film, and posits the group's desire to return to their simpler, troublemaking adolescence. Perhaps this longing stems from the poverty of the present requirement, which develops due to each character's individual situation, or maybe is spurred along by their reunion. In either case, their antics throughout the film indiscriminately depict a nostalgia for a time characterized by adolescent freedom. Because their present occurs at the crossroads of childhood and adulthood, and anxiety appears to be quelled momentarily in their recapturing of their youth. Likewise, Dazed and Confused offers a similar interpretation. The character's desire to remain present is equivalent for their desire of stagnant adolescence. This appears as a response to time's perpetual motion. While the past is undoubtedly not always good, the allure of adolescence appears to somehow quell all feelings of negativity. The very act of being present because a person wants to live without regrets appears to be a nostalgic sentiment. That is, in foreseeing the potentiality of longing for missed opportunities, the act of being present seeks to be preventative of this. Despite this, the present still lies at the end of the funnel, imbued by past experiences and leading out into an unpredictable future. The characters cannot escape nostalgia for the present.